The courtroom was a place where masks were inevitably stripped away. For 40 years, these benches had witnessed every iteration of human ego, from the stuttering liar to the shouting narcissist. But the defendant who walked in that day brought a different brand of chaos, a toxic, entitlement-driven arrogance that felt less like a defense and more like an invasion. She entered the room not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. She moved with a calculated, deliberate stride, her head held at an angle that screamed superiority, convinced that the laws governing mere mortals didn't apply to her. She wasn't just there to argue a case, she was there to dominate the room, to make it clear that she was the one pulling the strings. She treated the judicial process not as a search for truth, but as a sport, a performance where she was the undisputed lead. She wore her attitude like armor, impenetrable and gleaming, completely oblivious to the fact that she was stepping into an environment designed specifically to dismantle exactly what she was. Judge Judy sat at the bench, her presence a silent, immovable force. She had seen thousands of people, just like this woman, individuals whose entire lives were a series of unearned victories, won through bullying and bad faith. The defendant, let's call her Karen, sat at the table and adjusted her blazer with a smirk, looking around as if she were inspecting the quality of a resort. She believed that because she had been the loudest voice in every room she had ever occupied, she would be the loudest voice here, too. She was wrong. The air in the room was thin, charged with a tension that anyone with common sense would have recognized as a warning. The camera crew, seasoned professionals who had captured every nuance of human breakdown, instinctively tightened their framing. They knew the signals. They saw the way the judge's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical focus of a predator watching prey wander into a trap. And then, it happened. In a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris, Karen leaned across the table, her expression twisting into a smug grin, and hurled the insult. "Skinny witch!" The words didn't just break the sound barrier, they shattered the very foundation of the hearing. The courtroom went dead silent. It was a vacuum of noise, a stifling pause that pressed against the walls. It was the sound of a career, a reputation, and an ego committing suicide in real time. Karen had finally crossed the line, and she didn't even realize she had pushed the judge past the point of no return. The trap was set, and she had walked right into the center of it with a smile on her face. The silence that followed the insult was not just an absence of noise, it was a physical weight pressing down on the courtroom. It was the kind of hush that precedes an earthquake. Every single person in that gallery, the spectators who had come for the drama, the litigants waiting for their own cases to be called, even the court reporters froze. They looked at each other with wide eyes, sharing a collective realization. Karen had just made the gravest mistake of her life. She had poked a sleeping bear, and now the entire room was bracing for the mauling. The camera crew, seasoned veterans of reality television, didn't need a producer to tell them what to do. The main camera slowly, almost reverently, zoomed in on Judge Judy's face, catching the imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. It was a micro-expression, a flash of pure, focused intensity that signaled the end of the game for the defendant. Karen, however, was still trapped in her own delusion. She hadn't noticed the shift in the temperature of the room. She was too busy basking in the echo of her own voice, convinced she had delivered a lethal blow. She leaned back in her chair, her arms folded, a look of smug triumph plastered across her face. She looked like a gambler who had just played an ace, unaware that the house was about to take everything she had. She believed that by insulting the judge, she had somehow bypassed the hierarchy of the courtroom. She thought that because she had been louder, she had assumed the mantle of power. It was the arrogance of the ignorant. Everyone in that room knew Judge Judy's reputation better than the woman standing before her did. For decades, the bench had been a graveyard for big egos. The room had witnessed every type of human failing imaginable, from pathetic scammers and calculated manipulators to the loudest, most aggressive screamers. They had all walked through those doors with the same flawed blueprint, the belief that they could shout the judge into submission. They all left with their pride in tatters. But Karen had gone a step further. She hadn't just argued her case poorly, she had attacked the institution itself. She had insulted the personification of order, and the air of anticipation in the gallery was no longer about the legal outcome of the case. It was about the impending dismantling of a person's ego. The bailiff, a man who had stood guard through countless outbursts, stood motionless, his posture suggesting he was merely waiting for the signal to act. The tension was now so thick you could carve it. Karen sat there, smiling that tight, ugly smile, completely unaware that she had just handed the judge the most perfect public opportunity to expose her for exactly what she was. The trap was sprung, and for the next few seconds, the only thing that existed in that room was the ticking clock of Karen's own undoing. The courtroom, usually a hive of low-level anxiety and bureaucratic drone, fell into a silence so profound it felt like the air itself had been sucked out. It wasn't the kind of silence that happens when a judge is reviewing a file. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of 100 people witnessing a slow-motion collision. Karen stood there, the word skinny witch still hanging in the air, a verbal graffiti tagged onto the sanctity of the bench. She looked around, expecting to see a courtroom erupt in titters, perhaps some validation for her audacity. Instead, she found herself the centerpiece of a room that had suddenly become acutely aware of its own gravity. Judge Judy sat perfectly still. She didn't flush with the expected flash of indignation, nor did she snap back with a defensive, emotional retort. She merely adjusted her glasses, a slow, deliberate movement that felt magnified by the stillness. Her eyes locked onto the defendant with a gaze that was neither angry nor confused. It was analytical. It was the look of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive specimen. For Judy, this wasn't an insult. It was data. It was the final, defining piece of evidence she needed to categorize the woman standing before her. She knew that people like Karen operated on a specific, flawed frequency, one where they believed aggression was a proxy for power and volume was a surrogate for authority. Karen, completely oblivious to the shift in the room's temperature, mistook the judge's composure for hesitation. She stood up a little straighter, her chin tilted at a defiant, smug angle. She genuinely believed that because she had been the loudest, she had won the opening gambit. She had spent a lifetime using this exact brand of explosive, unchecked arrogance to bend the world to her will, whether it was at the DMV, a local department store, or the neighbor's driveway. She assumed that here, in the most famous courtroom in America, she would be no different. She didn't realize that she hadn't just walked into a courtroom, she had walked into a trap. She had mistaken the judge's strategic patience for weakness, not realizing that for a woman who had spent 4 decades listening to the absolute worst of human nature, a petty insult was about as threatening as a paper cut. The audience in the gallery was frozen. They were watching a master at work, and they knew the game was rigged in the judge's favor, even if Karen didn't. The bailiff, a figure who had seen his fair share of outbursts, didn't move a muscle, his posture radiating a silent, professional anticipation. Every second that ticked by without a rebuttal from the bench was another layer of paint stripped from Karen's facade. She was performing a role that no one in the room wanted to see, and with every passing heartbeat, her credibility was leaking away. She thought she was the protagonist of this drama, but in reality, she was merely the setup for the punchline, and the audience was waiting for the judge to deliver the knockout. The silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of a reputation being quietly, systematically erased. The laughter that had erupted in the courtroom wasn't just amusement. It was the sound of a power structure shifting in real time. Judge Judy didn't just win the exchange. She had fundamentally altered the gravity of the room. Karen, the woman who had entered with the swagger of a conqueror, now looked like someone who had just realized she was wearing a costume in a serious room. Her face burned a deep, throbbing crimson, the kind of heat that comes from public humiliation when there is absolutely nowhere to hide. She had walked in believing that her volume and her manufactured aggression would be her greatest assets, that she could steamroll these proceedings just as she did with every waiter, cashier, and neighbor she had ever crossed. But here, in the cold light of the bench, those tactics weren't just useless, they were evidence. Judy leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the defendant's face. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to. The power of her position, combined with the lethal precision of her decades of experience, turned her voice into a scalpel. "You think being loud makes you powerful?" Judy continued, the words measured, cold and biting. "You think insulting people makes you intimidating, but all you've really done today is expose exactly who you are." The words weren't merely an admonishment, they were a diagnosis. Judy was deconstructing Karen's entire methodology in front of a captive audience, stripping away the ego that had carried her through years of petty disputes and manufactured conflicts. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting around the room, desperate to find an ally, a sympathizer, or even just a loophole to escape the crushing weight of the truth. But there were none to be found. The courtroom was silent, a silent verdict being rendered by everyone present. For the first time all day, Karen didn't look like a woman who expected to win. She looked like a woman who was suddenly, violently aware of how small her world had become. She opened her mouth to interrupt, a reflex for someone used to dominating every conversation, but Judy silenced her with a single, sharp look that rendered the defendant mute. "No," Judy said firmly, shutting down the impulse to spout more noise. "You've spoken enough." That single word landed with more impact than any gavel strike. It was a boundary line drawn in ink. Karen sat back, her shoulders slumping. She had spent a lifetime relying on the fear of others to sustain her sense of power, mistaken the silence of intimidated people for respect. Now, she was experiencing the silence of a room that was no longer afraid of her, but instead was deeply, profoundly unimpressed. The realization was sinking in. The people watching weren't on her side. They were watching her unravel. The smug grin was gone, replaced by a raw, naked insecurity that she had spent years trying to bury under layers of artificial bravado. She had walked into a courtroom, but she was finding herself in a mirror, forced to look at the ugly reflection of her own lack of discipline. The shift was absolute. The battle of wills was over, and the victor hadn't needed to raise her voice once. The room no longer felt like a normal courtroom hearing. It felt like the final act of a slow-motion unraveling. Karen, who had entered the chamber with an inflated sense of self, was now visibly shrinking in her seat. The laughter from the gallery, a sound she had once assumed would be her shield, had turned into a sharp, piercing blade of ridicule. It was the specific kind of laughter that doesn't just mock, it invalidates. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The power of her position, combined with her decades of experience, turned her calm demeanor into a far more effective weapon than any shouted lecture could ever be. Judy leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Karen's, sharp and unyielding. "You think being loud makes you powerful," Judy continued, her voice steady and rhythmic. "You think insulting people makes you intimidating, but all you've really done today is expose exactly who you are." These weren't just words, they were a diagnosis. Judy was performing a psychological autopsy, stripping away the ego that had carried Karen through years of petty disputes and manufactured conflicts. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her posture stiffening. For the first time, she no longer looked like the main character in her own drama. She looked like a footnote to her own failure. Karen tried to maintain the mask of arrogance, but it was slipping. She opened her mouth to interrupt, a reflex for someone accustomed to overpowering others, but Judy cut her off with a sharp, singular gesture. "No," she said firmly. "You've spoken enough." That single word landed with more impact than any gavel strike. It was a boundary line drawn in ink. Karen sat back, her shoulders slumping. She had spent a lifetime relying on the fear of others to sustain her power, mistaken the silence of intimidated people for respect. Now, she was experiencing the silence of a room that was no longer afraid of her, but instead was deeply, profoundly unimpressed. The realization hit Karen with the force of a physical blow. She was entirely, utterly powerless. She had come to court to wage war, but she had only succeeded in stripping herself bare. The smug, confident woman who had entered the courtroom was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly looked very small, very tired, and very defeated. Every sentence Judy delivered stripped away another layer of the illusion Karen had worked so hard to maintain. The audience, the people Karen would usually deem beneath her, were now the ultimate judges of her character, and their verdict was clear. They saw her not as a strong, powerful force, but as a person whose life strategy was nothing more than a series of exhausting, childish tantrums. Karen's breath hitched. She realized that nothing she said would work anymore, because the mask had been removed, and the truth underneath was not the image she wanted the world to see. She was trapped in the spotlight of her own making, and the judge was just getting started with the dismantling of her worldview. Karen, now realizing that her words had lost their bite, tried to adjust her strategy. She straightened her back, attempting to reclaim a shred of the dignity that had eroded in seconds. "You don't know anything about me," she muttered, her voice lacking the venom it had possessed just moments earlier. It was a classic deflection, a desperate reach for sympathy where there was none to be found. But Judge Judy wasn't looking for excuses. She was looking for accountability. "Oh, I know enough." Judy snapped back, the interruption clean and sharp. "I know that mature adults don't walk into courtrooms throwing playground insults because they can't control their emotions." The courtroom, once buzzing with the potential for a shouting match, had now become a theater of scrutiny. Every person in the gallery was watching Karen's performance fall apart. They weren't looking at a powerful, misunderstood woman. They were looking at a person who had weaponized her own bad temper and was now being forced to pay the price. Karen's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and genuine panic. She was realizing, with a sinking sensation in her chest, that her usual tactics were not just failing, they were accelerating her own public downfall. "You're twisting everything!" Karen cried out, her voice rising to a pitch that sounded less like a defense and more like a plea. "No," Judy corrected her, calm as the eye of a hurricane. "I am clarifying everything." That line landed with the finality of a gavel. It wasn't an argument, it was a correction of reality. The audience reacted again, not with laughter this time, but with a murmuring of agreement. That was Judy's true gift. She didn't just argue better than the people in front of her, she reframed the entire context of their existence, turning their own behavior into the evidence against them. Karen's insults, once thought of as powerful, were now being categorized by the room as childish, desperate, and utterly embarrassing. She was finally trapped, not by the judge, but by the weight of her own actions. The courtroom had become a mirror, and for the first time, Karen was forced to look at herself not as she wanted to be, but as she truly was. The smug grin was Tonsayam, Tonsayam, Tonsayam backs to soul, Tonsayam. Tonxiao exposed face of a woman who had realized her volume didn't carry weight here. The battle of wills was effectively over, and the victor had won without ever needing to break her composure. The air in the courtroom was thick, the kind of heavy pressure that precedes a total system failure. Karen stood there, physically present but emotionally unraveling. Her desperate attempt to claim that Judy humiliated people for entertainment was a transparent attempt to flip the script, a last-ditch effort to position herself as the victim of a power-tripping authority figure. But in this courtroom, facts were the only currency that mattered, and Karen was completely bankrupt. She had bet everything on the idea that if she screamed loud enough, she would be believed. She was wrong. Judge Judy didn't even shift in her seat. She didn't offer a lecture on her career or her accolades. She simply looked through the defendant as if seeing the fragile, terrified person hiding behind the performative rage. "No," Judy replied, her voice cutting through the tension like cold steel. "People embarrass themselves. I simply refuse to pretend otherwise." The courtroom erupted again. It wasn't just a win for the judge. It was a total rejection of the defendant's entire worldview. The laughter that rippled through the room was sharp, validating the judge's assessment. Karen's face tightened, her composure finally snapping. She had walked in believing that her volume and her aggression were marks of power. But here, in the cold light of the bench, they were just signs of a person who had spent a lifetime avoiding the mirror. Judy leaned forward just a fraction, the movement subtle yet commanding. "You walked in here insulting people instead of controlling yourself, and now you're upset because everyone can see the consequences of your own behavior." Karen tried to open her mouth, perhaps to salvage one last shred of pride, but Judy raised a single, steady finger. The gesture stopped Karen cold. It wasn't a shout, it was an absolute command. "Don't," Judy said, and the word fell with the finality of a gavel striking the desk. Karen froze. The air in the room was electric, heavy with the weight of her public exposure. For years, she had relied on the fear of others to sustain her sense of power. She had thrived in the discomfort she created, using it as a shield to keep the world at arm's length. But here, that tactic was utterly useless. She was facing someone who didn't fear her, someone who saw through the mask to the weak, insecure person underneath. The realization hit Karen then. She was entirely, utterly powerless. She had come to the court to wage war, but she had only succeeded in stripping herself bare. The smug, confident woman who had entered the courtroom was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly looked very small, very tired, and very defeated. She had wanted to control the room, but the room now controlled her. Every second she sat there, trapped by Judy's composure, was another second her pride was stripped away, layer by agonizing layer, in front of the people she so desperately wanted to impress. The battle of wills was effectively over, and the victor had won without ever needing to break her composure. The final moment of the hearing arrived, not with a bang, but with the cold precision of a closing book. Judge Judy leaned back, her hands folded over the documents that had been the subject of such unnecessary chaos. She looked at Karen, not with malice, but with a stark, unsettling pity. "Being loud may get attention," Judy said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to vibrate through the wood paneling. but character is what earns respect. And today, you showed everyone exactly which one you lack. The courtroom was absolute in its silence. There was no room for rebuttal. The gavel had fallen, not just on the case, but on the defendant's entire approach to existence. Karen, for the first time in what was surely a long, tumultuous life, found herself without a comeback. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The rage, the entitlement, the desperate need to be the loudest entity in the space it had all evaporated, leaving behind a woman who looked suddenly, painfully ordinary. She slowly stood up, her movements devoid of the aggressive flair she had displayed upon entering. As she made her way toward the exit, she didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the plaintiff. She didn't even look at the judge. She stared straight ahead, a person trying to navigate the exit with the heavy, leaden steps of someone who had just lost the most important fight of her life, the battle with her own self-delusion. Everyone watched her go. The gallery, previously a mix of amusement and tension, was now quiet with a contemplative stillness. They weren't just watching a defendant leave a courtroom, they were watching the public collapse of an illusion. Karen walked out the doors, the hinges groaning as they sealed behind her, shutting off the stage she had failed to master. Outside those doors, the world would likely continue as it had, but in this room, something definitive had happened. A lesson had been served, cold and hard. The aftermath in the courtroom was telling. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The authority that Judy represented hadn't been weakened by the insult. It had been reinforced by the dismantling of the challenger. People moved to leave, their faces thoughtful. They weren't whispering about the insult that had become trivial, almost embarrassing to recall. Instead, they were talking about the judge's response. They were talking about the power of restraint. It was a stark reminder of what true authority actually is. It does not need to raise its voice to be heard. It does not need to panic to be felt. It simply stands, observes, and when the time is right, it corrects the imbalance with surgical accuracy. Karen had arrived looking for a fight and left with a mirror, forced to see the reality of her own behavior. And as the court moved on to the next case, the memory of her defeat lingered as a permanent testament to a simple, unyielding truth. Arrogance may demand the spotlight, but discipline always owns the stage. The doors had closed, the case was shut, and in the quiet of the chambers, justice had not just been done, it had been taught.